There are places where nothing should exist at all. No soil deep enough to hold a town. No roads that forgive mistakes. No margin for delay, error, or comfort. Kennecott was built anyway. Not as a settlement, not as a frontier experiment, but as a machine placed directly into the wilderness. A vertical stack of wood, steel, tunnels, cables, and schedules, all aligned toward a single purpose buried high in the mountains. Everything here arrived because it had to. Everything stayed only as long as it paid. The scale was out of proportion to its surroundings. 14 stories of mill rising from a glacial valley, miles of rail forced across rivers that did not hold still, or moving downhill through air, gravity doing the work humans could not. This was not isolation by accident. It was isolation accepted, calculated, and funded. Men lived here without families. Buildings existed without futures. The town never pretended it would last. And then one day the movement stopped. No siege, no fire, no final disaster. Just silence where a system had once been perfectly balanced. Kennecott still stands. Not because it survived, but because it was left exactly where it failed. The ore that justified everything. The first thing Kennecott offered was not a town or even a mine. It was a contradiction. High on Bonanza Ridge, copper appeared where copper should not have been economically possible. Not scattered, not diluted, not buried deep behind uncertainty, but concentrated. Exposed and unusually pure, chalcocite so rich that assays approached levels rarely seen anywhere in North America. This was not the kind of discovery that invited gradual development. It demanded immediate commitment. The location resisted every conventional rule of mining logic. No port, no roads, no existing labor base. Glaciers moved through the valleys below. Rivers rewrote their channels without notice. Winter closed the region for months at a time. Nothing about the surrounding landscape suggested permanence or accommodation. Yet the ore did not need persuasion. Geology had already done the argument. Along the contact between limestone and greenstone, copper had accumulated in a form that made distance almost irrelevant. Earlier observers, including U.S. Geological Survey work in the region, had already marked the conditions as promising. When prospectors confirmed it in 1900, the question was no longer whether the copper could be mined, but how far a company would go to claim it. Ownership consolidated quickly. Claims changed hands from discovery to capital with little delay. What mattered was not who found the copper, but who could afford to isolate it, move it and convert it into cash. Control passed into the hands of financiers and engineers who understood that the deposit's value lay not only in its richness but in its speed. High-grade ore loses its advantage if it waits. The decision that followed was decisive and inflexible. Kennecott would not adapt to Alaska. Alaska would be engineered around Kennecott. This was not a mining camp evolving into a town. It was a system designed in advance. Railroad, port, mill, steamship line, conceived as a single mechanism. Each component existed only because the others would exist. Remove one and the entire structure collapsed. Capital moved first. Tens of millions of dollars were committed before ore ever moved in volume. A railroad would be driven nearly 200 miles from the interior to tidewater. It would cross active river systems, unstable ground, and glacial terrain. It would not wait for ideal conditions. It would be finished because delay cost more than risk. Construction did not slow to accommodate the environment. It cut through it. Bridges were placed where rivers did not stay still. Track was laid where winter would later reclaim it. Maintenance was assumed as a permanent cost, not a temporary inconvenience. The railroad was not an accessory. It was the mine's spine. When the first train reached Kennecott in 1911, it did not arrive at a town in progress. It arrived at a functioning industrial node. Ore bins, tunnels, tramways, and a towering concentrator mill were already positioned to receive material from the mountain. The mountain itself had been hollowed methodically. Miles of underground workings connected separate mines into a single extraction network. High above the valley floor, ore was moved not by road, but by air suspended on cables, descending under gravity toward the mill. Energy was conserved where possible. Labor was focused where it could not be replaced. The mill dominated everything. 14 stories tall, built entirely of wood, it was designed to process stone continuously, crushing, separating, concentrating. The limestone discarded, the copper preserved. Nothing decorative, nothing surplus. Its height was not symbolic, it was functional. Gravity reduced effort. Time reduced cost. By the middle of the decade, the system was fully engaged. Copper moved from mountain to mill, from mill to railcar, from railcar to ship, from ship to smelter, and without pause. The distance between extraction and refinement spanned hundreds of miles, but the process itself functioned as a single, uninterrupted line. Output followed accordingly. Within a few years, Kennecott ranked among the most productive copper operations in the United States. Not because it was large in workforce or territory, but because it wasted almost nothing. High-grade ore meant fewer tons moved for greater return. Infrastructure that seemed excessive on paper proved efficient in practice. The corporate structure adjusted to match the scale. Ownership reorganized, not to change direction but to formalize success. The operation became a cornerstone asset, a source of capital that would later fund expansion elsewhere. Kennecott was not treated as a permanent headquarters. It was treated as a peak, something to be fully exploited while conditions allowed. And already embedded in its design was a limit. The town that grew alongside the mill did not grow outward. It filled only the space required to keep the system running. Housing was temporary by intention. Amenities were calculated, not generous. Men worked long hours, lived close together, and left when they could. There were no neighborhoods, no independent businesses, no future subdivisions waiting to happen. Nothing here was meant to outlast the ore. The mountain dictated the timeline. The company accepted it. Kennecott was never promised longevity, only efficiency, and for a time efficiency was enough. Kennecott did not grow, it assembled. Every structure followed a decision, already made elsewhere, in offices far from the valley, on balance sheets that treated distance as a variable, not a barrier. The town existed only because the system required bodies to operate it, and even then, only the minimum number. At its peak, several hundred men worked the mines and mill. Fewer lived in the town itself. There was no attempt to attract families, permanence, or civic life beyond what kept labor stable enough to continue production. The layout made this clear. Management occupied offices and private residences positioned close to the operational core. Workers lived in bunkhouses, dense and communal, designed for rotation rather than routes. Privacy was not part of the plan. Efficiency was. Daily life followed the mine. Shifts ran long. Weeks blurred together. Work did not pause for weekends in any meaningful sense. The company provided what was necessary: food, medical care, a store, basic recreation, not as benefits, but as safeguards against interruption. A hospital stood ready not out of compassion, but necessity. A schoolhouse existed because skilled staff sometimes arrived with families, not because the town expected generations. A recreation hall absorbed excess energy that might otherwise become unrest. Even leisure was functional. The skating rink, the tennis court, the organized events, and all served to keep men present, capable, and predictable. Kennecott was not harsh by frontier standards, but it was tightly managed. Wages were competitive. Time off was limited. Movement was controlled by geography and schedule. There was nowhere else to go. Beyond the buildings, the landscape closed in quickly. Glaciers, steep ridges, unstable weather. Travel out of the valley depended entirely on the same railroad that existed to remove ore. When the trains ran, supplies arrived and copper left. When they did not, the town waited. Nothing in Kennecott was independent. Food, fuel, equipment, mail, all arrived through the same logistical artery. The town could not trade with neighboring settlements because there were none. It could not pivot to another industry because no infrastructure existed to support one. This was not oversight, it was design. All buildings were erected within a narrow window of time, and almost all before production peaked. Once our output began to decline, construction stopped entirely. No new neighborhoods appeared. No alternate facilities were added. Investment froze the moment it stopped producing immediate return. The town reached its final form early, and stayed there. Above it all, the mill never slept. Ore moved continuously, governed by gravity and routine. The noise of crushing rock, the movement of belts and chutes, the steady rhythm of industrial labor defined the valley's soundscape. The mountain was no longer silent. It was being translated into shipment schedules and production totals. And yet, even at full output, the imbalance remained obvious. The scale of infrastructure far exceeded the human presence required to operate it. Massive buildings loomed over a town that never filled them emotionally. Kennecott felt less like a community and more like a support scaffold wrapped around a machine. The machine performed exceptionally. For years, returns justified everything: the railroad's constant repairs, the cost of winter operations, the isolation, the concentration of capital in a place that offered nothing else. But the same efficiency that made Kennecott valuable also narrowed its margin for error. There was no flexibility built into the system, no redundancy beyond what extraction demanded. When the ore body began to thin, there would be no gradual transition, no alternative use for the town, no secondary purpose waiting to absorb decline. Kennecott had been engineered for a single condition: high-grade copper moving fast, and conditions do not negotiate. For years, Kennecott functioned on alignment. Ore quality justified distance. Distance justified infrastructure. Infrastructure justified cost. As long as those numbers balanced, the system held. By the late 1920s, they no longer did. The richest sections of the deposit had already been removed. What remained required more effort for less return. Tunnels extended farther for smaller gains. The mill processed more rock to produce the same amount of copper. Efficiency narrowed not through failure but through exhaustion. The mountain was still there. The copper was not. At the same time, the fixed costs remained unchanged. The railroad still crossed unstable rivers. Bridges still required constant repair. Snow, ice, and seasonal flooding did not become cheaper simply because the ore body declined. Every mile of track demanded attention whether it carried profit or not. Isolation, once a tolerable expense, became a liability. Corporate attention shifted accordingly. The parent company no longer depended on Kennecott alone. Capital flowed toward newer properties, closer to ports, easier to scale, and less vulnerable to a single logistical failure. Kennecott's role changed from cornerstone to contributor, and then from contributor to question. No crisis forced the decision. There was no collapse in a single year, no dramatic accident that ended operations overnight. Instead, the logic that had created Kennecott quietly reversed. High-grade ore had once justified extraordinary effort. Now ordinary ore did not. The system had been designed for speed and volume, not endurance. When output declined, there was no mechanism to slow down gracefully. Maintenance costs rose as returns fell. Repairs competed with profits. Every season demanded reinvestment with diminishing certainty. The town felt this before it was announced. Work became more selective. Some sections closed while others continued. The rhythm changed. The confidence that had once governed daily life softened into caution. New construction never resumed. Equipment was used longer. Replacement slowed. Nothing expanded. Everything waited. From a distance, Kennecott still appeared active. Trains still ran. The mill still processed ore. Men still worked long hours. But the margins had thinned, to the point where continuation required justification rather than assumption. That justification did not arrive. In 1938, the decision was made at the corporate level, where Kennecott had always been governed. The mine would close, not because it had failed, but because it had completed its purpose. The response was swift. Final shipments were scheduled. Remaining equipment was prepared for removal where practical. Men were reassigned or released. There was no attempt to repurpose the town or extend operations artificially. When the last train departed that September, it carried more than ore. It removed the system's reason to exist. Almost immediately, the railroad itself became surplus. Without copper to move, its maintenance could not be justified. Applications to abandon the line followed. Approval came within months. Nature handled the rest. A major bridge across the Copper River was lost the following spring. The connection was gone permanently. What followed was not decay but withdrawal. Buildings were left standing. Machinery remained in place. There was no dismantling effort scaled to the site's original ambition. Recovering materials from such isolation cost more than they were worth. Kennecott had been abandoned for the same reason it had been built. The numbers no longer worked. By the early 1940s, the valley was empty of its workforce. No one was left to operate the mill. No schedules remained to justify the railroad. The machine had been shut down, not violently but completely. And unlike many industrial sites, nothing replaced it. No successor industry arrived. No settlement adapted the remains. No transition softened the end. Kennecott had never been designed to change, only to stop. Kennecott did not collapse into ruin. It was simply left behind. Once the decision to withdraw was executed, There was no return to dismantle what had been built. The distance that had once protected profit now protected the remains. Retrieving machinery, salvaging structures, or stripping the site of usable material required the very infrastructure that had just been abandoned. With the railroad gone, removal no longer made economic sense. Rails stayed where they lay. Buildings stood unopened. The mill froze mid-process, emptied of motion but not of form. For a time, the corridor out of the valley existed only in fragments. Sections of track remained usable by locals with improvised motor cars. Short spurs were repurposed briefly during the war years. But these were temporary adaptations, not revivals. They did not reconnect Kennecott to a broader system. By the early 1960s, even the rails were gone. What remained was the outline of an industrial decision etched into the landscape. The road that eventually replaced the tracks followed the same path. Not because it was ideal, but because it already existed. Kennecott's route through the wilderness proved more durable than the industry that required it. The town itself changed very little. Because there was no active removal, decay proceeded slowly. Cold temperatures and low moisture preserved wood that would have failed elsewhere. Vegetation did not overtake structures quickly. Roof lines held. Walls stayed upright. The mill, once the loudest presence in the valley, became its most visible absence. 14 stories of timber still rose over the site, no longer processing stone, no longer requiring labor. It remained because nothing came after it. No new industry needed the space. No settlement demanded reuse. Kennecott existed in a pause that lasted decades. When preservation finally arrived, it did not reconstruct or modernize. Stabilization replaced demolition. The goal was not revival, but arrest, holding the site in the state where the system stopped. No utilities were added, no new purpose imposed. The buildings were left to explain themselves. What survives today is not a monument to ambition, nor a warning rendered in signage. It is a complete industrial organism, halted intact. The town's coherence is not accidental. It is the direct result of its design and its abandonment aligning perfectly. Kennecott was extracted, not destroyed. The copper left first. The people followed. The structure stayed. And in the absence of use, the valley returned to silence. Not by reclaiming the site, but by ignoring it. The landscape did not need to erase Kennecott. It only needed to outlast it. Kennecott's stillness is not accidental. It is procedural. Every choice made during its rise narrowed the number of outcomes available at its end. The town did not fade into another purpose because no such purpose had ever been designed. It did not fragment into private ownership or informal reuse because nothing here was modular or transferable. Kennecott was complete the moment it stopped. Its buildings were too specific. Its layout too centralized. Its reason for existing too singular. Unlike older settlements that accumulated layers of meaning over time, Kennecott accumulated only infrastructure. Each structure answered a technical requirement. When that requirement disappeared, the structure became mute. The concentrator mill had no secondary function. The bunkhouses had no surrounding economy. The tunnels led only to depleted stone. Even the town's visual unity tells this story. The consistent construction period, the uniform materials, the absence of later additions, all indicate a place, finished early and left unchanged. There was no slow adaptation because adaptation would have implied uncertainty during operation. Kennecott did not hedge its future, it consumed it. This is why the site remains unusually legible. You can still read the sequence of decisions in its physical form. The aerial tramways reveal how gravity replaced labor. The mill's height reveals how energy was conserved. The proximity of housing to production reveals how time was controlled. Nothing is decorative. Nothing is sentimental. The town does not invite nostalgia because it never contained it. People lived here, worked here, endured here, but they were not meant to stay. Their presence was functional, interchangeable, and temporary by design. That temporariness extended even to ownership. When the company withdrew, it did not negotiate with the site. It did not plan for transition. It did not seek continuity. It simply exited because the system had been exhausted. What followed was not neglect. It was irrelevance. Decades passed with little change because nothing needed to change. The valley did not require redevelopment. The structures did not obstruct new plans. The environment did not demand rapid decay. Kennecott became a rare thing in industrial history, a place where abandonment did not lead to erasure. Later preservation did not reverse time. It merely acknowledged that time had already stopped. Stabilization efforts did not restore function. They prevented collapse long enough for the system's logic to remain visible. Today, Kennecott does not explain itself with plaques or reconstructed narratives. It does not dramatize its own importance. It simply remains where decisions left it. A town without expansion, an industry without succession, a machine without motion. Kennecott's endurance is not a triumph. It is evidence. Evidence that the most powerful industrial systems are not those that last forever, but those that extract everything they were designed to extract and then disappear without argument. Here, the silence is not haunting because something terrible happened. It is haunting because nothing else did. The system worked, then it ended, and the landscape kept going. Time did not rush back into Kennecott. It arrived slowly and without intent. For decades after abandonment, the site existed outside of momentum. It was no longer industrial, but it was not reclaimed either. There were no scavengers in large numbers, no redevelopment schemes, no urgency to reinterpret what had been left behind. Distance protected it, climate preserved it, irrelevance stabilized it. The valley did not need Kennecott, and Kennecott no longer needed the valley. When formal preservation eventually arrived, it did so carefully, almost reluctantly. The goal was not restoration in the traditional sense. Nothing here was brought back to life. The effort focused on preventing collapse, holding beams, sealing roofs, slowing weather so the structure could remain readable. The site was treated as a finished sentence. No modern utilities were threaded through the town. No contemporary architecture was added to soften the contrast. Nothing was redesigned to feel welcoming or complete, because Kennecott was already complete. What survives today is not a memory of activity, but a measurement of scale. The height of the mill against the valley walls. The distance between buildings designed to move men quickly, not comfortably. The emptiness between structures that once pulsed with schedules. The absence is precise. You can see how much energy once passed through this place by how much space it still occupies. The mountain above is scarred but intact. The valley below remains indifferent. The town sits between them, fixed at the moment when extraction stopped being profitable. No one dismantled it because no one needed to. No one rebuilt it because no one could. Kennecott does not ask to be interpreted. It does not explain itself emotionally. It stands as an industrial fact, a place built entirely around a resource, a system optimized for speed and return, a town that never imagined survival as a goal. When the copper ended, everything else followed logically. The people left. The train stopped. The silence stayed. And today nothing here pretends otherwise. If this documentary aligns with the way you prefer history to be told, restrained, factual, and grounded in decisions rather than spectacle, subscribe to the channel. These stories continue not as nostalgia, but as records of how ambition intersects with landscape and how quickly even the largest systems can become still.